This is the episode where the creators of Deep Space Nine said, let's do a show that will make our audience cry really hard for the next 30 years. And I respect that. This is a review of my favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Visitor. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. Not only is this my favorite episode of Deep Space Nine, it's also probably the episode I've watched the most times. I've watched it twice in the last month, in fact. Back at the beginning of February, Dana and I watched it for our Trek Reluctantly watch-along live stream, and I've just watched it again this morning to prepare for this review. I guess I didn't really need to watch it in order to do this. I had plenty to say about it already, but I wanted to watch it. The Visitor is a heavy episode emotionally. It's a heartbreaking episode, but it continually pulls me back because it does what it does so well and so impressively. Yes, it's sad, but it's also beautiful. The story takes what was already a familiar Star Trek trope at the time and would become an even more well-worn trope in years to come, the alternate future, and gets there in an interesting way and uses it to tell a heartfelt, character-driven story that is augmented by the show's sci-fi elements. The characters that drive the story are Ben and Jake Sisko, which is a smart choice since their relationship is one of the strongest and best defined on the show, and it's unlike any other relationship we've seen in a Star Trek series, at least among series regulars. Healthy parent-child dynamics are not really a Star Trek thing. But by season 4 of DS9, Ben and Jake's father-son connection is established well enough that the prospect of that connection being broken is enough of a hook to pull us right in. The hook is dropped at the end of the cold open by Jake, who is an old man, and who tells a young visitor that the story of why he stopped writing begins many years ago when he was 18, and the worst thing that can happen to a young man happened to him. His father died. So right away, we know this will not be a typical Deep Space Nine episode. We also know intellectually that whatever the circumstances by which Jake's father dies in the episode, it's not going to stick. This is the second episode of season 4. They ain't killing off Captain Sisko. But one of the marks of the greatness of the episode is how, when you're watching it, that doesn't matter. What matters is the present, what the characters, specifically Jake, are struggling with in the here and now. And no matter how many times I watch it, knowing everything that happens, it still gets me. A big reason for that is the acting. Deep Space Nine had maybe the best cast of actors that any Star Trek series has ever had, and it regularly leaned on them to carry thematically and emotionally complex stories within the superficially silly context of Star Trek. Here, the only members of the regular cast who get any significant time are Avery Brooks and Siroc Lofton, and they make the most of it, and I'll talk about them more in a bit, but the reason most of the regular cast is sidelined is because this episode is carried by a guest actor, Tony Todd, as the elder Jake Sisko. Tony Todd had been a recurring guest actor on Star Trek before this. He played Worf's brother Kurn on TNG, but with The Visitor, he gets a rare opportunity to show us what a wonderful actor he is. Because of Todd's imposing stature and deep voice, he's often been cast as villains. He was Candyman in those movies. He's the big guy, the scary guy, the guy who could kill you and is probably going to. But in The Visitor, he shows us a completely different side of himself. Todd plays Jake Sisko after the apparent loss of his father in an accident aboard the Defiant. His Jake is wounded, haunted, literally haunted as it turns out, because Ben Sisko isn't dead, but trapped in subspace, and he reappears seemingly at random for a few minutes at a time before vanishing again. Todd, as this older Jake, is the furthest thing imaginable from his familiar, intimidating persona. He's gentle, he's soft-spoken, he's vulnerable. It's a delicate, tender performance, and all the more impressive if you know enough about Todd's career overall to recognize what a departure it is. Besides playing Jake in the body of the story from age 37 on, Todd also plays Old Man Jake, who serves as the narrator, telling the story to his young visitor, Melanie. I don't want to oversell the performance or the episode. This is a comparison, not an equivalization, but I've always viewed playing Old Man Jake as Tony Todd's Salieri moment. Like F. Murray Abraham in Amadeus, Todd takes scenes that could easily have been there only for the purpose of narrative convenience to move the plot forward and fill in gaps along the way, and elevates them through his performance, investing them with genuine heart and character. This is a great Jake episode. Not only do we have Tony Todd delivering his best Star Trek performance as older Jake, Siroc Lofton gives perhaps his best performance of the series in the few scenes he has in his usual role of Jake. Before ceding the character to Tony Todd, Lofton is able to craft a convincing portrait of a young man who has suddenly lost the most important relationship in his life, his rock of support. There's a scene between Jake and Major Kira, where Kira encourages Jake to leave the station due to escalating military tensions in the area, and Jake pleads with Kira, "Please don't make me leave. This place is my home." He explains that everywhere he looks, he sees something that reminds him of his father, and if he leaves Deep Space Nine, Jake feels like he won't have anything left of him. Lofton has another great scene, this time with Avery Brooks, when Ben Sisko has reappeared a year after the accident on the Defiant. Jake breaks down, tearfully apologizes to his father for not believing he was still alive, and Ben takes his son's face in his hands and tells him it's all right. There was always a physical closeness between Ben and Jake, and between Avery Brooks and Siroc Lofton, who had a surrogate parent-child relationship in real life. They hug, they kiss, they display their affection for each other. There are no walls between them. It's a wonderful part of the show in general, and it's never used to greater emotional effect than it is in this episode. Here are a parent and a child who are as close to each other as any two characters in the entire Star Trek franchise. And now they are separated, and we can feel how difficult that separation is for both of them to bear. Of the episode's three main actors, Avery Brooks has the least amount of screen time, since after the accident that strands Sisko in subspace, he only appears in a handful of scenes. But does he ever make them count? I've often said that what I love about Sisko is that he is the most complete person of all the characters we meet in Star Trek. We see him as a commander, a friend, a religious figure, a widower, a husband, a mentor, a child, and a parent. In The Visitor, he's a parent. Full stop. And every one of his reappearances to Jake following the accident, Jake's life and well-being are the only things on his mind. "Talk to me," he says. "Tell me about what I've missed. Tell me about your life." When he realizes in his later visitations that Jake has given up his own dreams and ambitions to focus his efforts on rescuing Ben from subspace, Ben pleads with his son to let him go, to make a life for himself. "Your life is not about me, it's about you," Ben is saying. It's the message of a selfless, loving parent to his child. It tells us what kind of father Ben is and what kind of person he is. And because that's the kind of father and person he is, it also tells us why Jake finds it so impossible to let him go. The Visitor is about loss. It's about grief. It's about what happens when you find yourself unable to move on, or worse, when you feel like you have no right to move on. That's the position Jake finds himself in. Despite his father pleading with him, despite Ben repeatedly and sincerely absolving Jake of the sin of getting on with his own life, Jake keeps returning to the accident on the Defiant, to his father, and to his obsession with getting him back. Old Man Jake lives a long life, but an unfulfilled one, because he can never get very far from that hole that was left by the absence of his father. He can't move on. He can't let go. He can't heal. Therein lies his tragedy. He does ultimately solve the problem and free his father from subspace, but that solution is bittersweet, because old Jake is only able to achieve that at the cost of his own life. He realizes that if he dies during one of his father's appearances, the link between them will be severed, and Ben will snap back to the moment of the accident. If Ben can avoid the accident, none of what we've seen in the episode that takes place after that point will happen. Ben will be free. But old Jake, the Jake of the timeline that followed the accident, will cease to exist. There's a mixed message there, I think. On the one hand, old Jake proves himself to be his father's son. The most selfless and loving act of the episode is his own, choosing to sacrifice his existence to give his father and his younger self a second chance. But on the other hand, that act of sacrifice is the ultimate iteration of everything Ben has pleaded with Jake not to do. The child is able to resurrect the parent, but only at the cost of destroying himself. The story of Jake and Ben Sisko and the Visitor is beautiful, rich in character and feeling. It's a story about grief and loss that is told in a way that can only be done in science fiction. Here, the metaphorical becomes the literal. The dead parent is not merely a memory that lingers or an absence so keenly felt that they seem to still be there. Ben Sisko is literally still there, popping back into his son's life to remind him of everything that's been lost. Those of us who have had to deal with the death of people who were close to us can probably relate to what Jake goes through here. The notion of the person we lost coming back to us every few years is appealing. There's an element of comfort there, knowing the person we love still exists, knowing we'll see them again. But the briefness of the appearances and the long years that stretch out in between might only serve to amplify the pain of their loss, to make their absence even more unbearable. I've talked all about the acting up to this point, so before I finish the review, I do want to spare a few words for the writing. This is a beautiful script. It deepens what was already one of the most important relationships on the show, and it tells a story that breaks our hearts, that testifies not only to the paralyzing pain that can come with grief, but also to the enduring bonds of love that can form between people. Bonds so strong, not even death or a wacky Star Trek plot contrivance can break them. This script was written by Michael Taylor, who also wrote In the Pale Moonlight. And the thing about that is, if you ask a random bunch of Deep Space Nine fans what their favorite episode is, most of them will probably say either The Visitor or In the Pale Moonlight. And the rest will probably say Far Beyond the Stars, which, yeah. Taylor only wrote 4 episodes of Deep Space Nine in total, so for 2 of them to be arguably the 2 best episodes the series ever produced, that's pretty extraordinary. The Visitor was directed by David Livingston, one of the most prolific directors of Star Trek, who helmed episodes of TNG, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. Though never established on screen, the fish in Captain Picard's ready room was named Livingston after him. Of all the dozens of episodes of Star Trek Livingston directed, The Visitor is his finest work. Most impressive to me are the final scenes with old Jake. The episode is splendid all the way through, but what really puts it over the top is how expertly it sticks the landing, and the lion's share, or maybe I should say the lionfish's share, of the credit for that belongs to Livingston, I think. After Melanie, his young visitor, leaves, old man Jake prepares for the expected arrival of his father. He picks up a copy of his new short story collection, grabs his father's baseball, and sits down in a chair to wait. As the exquisite score composed by Dennis McCarthy plays, we dissolve to sometime later, when Jake has fallen asleep. Then, after a moment, we cut to a reverse shot of Ben Sisko watching Jake sleep. No fancy transition, no special effect. Ben is just there. It's simple and elegant, and I've always found it quite moving. There he is. And Jake wakes up, sees his father, smiles, and says, "I've been expecting you." I get asked a lot why this is my favorite episode. I'm not the only one who thinks The Visitor is the best DS9 episode, but it's a fair question because DS9 gives us so many options. I already mentioned In the Pale Moonlight and Far Beyond the Stars, both incredible episodes. There's also Duet and Past Tense and The Ship and Children of Time, and I could go on and on and on. What ultimately makes The Visitor my favorite is that Out of all the excellent episodes of Deep Space Nine, it's the one that most deeply touches my heart. It moves me. It makes me feel what the characters feel, their pain, their yearning, their love for each other. It gives me a sense of connection to them. And in doing so, reminds me of the importance of those connections to the people in my life. It does what I always hope art will do for me. It makes me feel something. That's why it's not only the best Deep Space Nine episode ever made, it's the best episode of any Star Trek series. Bar none, period. Those are my thoughts on The Visitor, my favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. What's your favorite Deep Space Nine episode? Please share it with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Don't forget to watch my review of the third episode of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard coming this weekend. I'm teaming up with my best friend and podcast co-host, Jason Harding, to review this final season of Picard, and our next review should be up sometime this weekend, hopefully on Saturday. And please join me again at this time next week for another retro review. Next time, it'll be my favorite episode of Star Trek Voyager, The Thaw. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.